shares this holy sight. In mosques and churches, the question rings, who is the King of Kings? With bold words, he offers proof. In sacred text, behold the truth. Revealing the light, one truth to show. Jesus is God, this he knows. From deserts wide to cities tight, Fadi shares this holy sight. Hearts open wide as the stories unfold of a Savior's love so brave and bold. Muslims come near, listen and see the truth of Christ who sets you free. Revealing the light, one truth to show. Jesus is God.
Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and I want to just from the bottom of my heart welcome all of you. I know it's been a while and it's been an up and down journey. And of course, many of you have been tracking with me about my most recent health issue, unexpected health issue related with my heart. And I thank the Lord that we discovered it in a timely fashion. I was actually in London when I first basically noticed it. And then I noticed again when I was in Egypt. And then we went to Turkey and nothing happened. So I assumed nothing was wrong except me maybe assuming things. But after return from Turkey, it ended up coming back again and we dealt with it. So thank you for all of you for your prayers and well wishes. They were received and appreciated. Today, of course, we're going to be doing a very short live stream, just about maybe 20-25 minutes long. We have with us here virtually Dr. Jay Smith, who have graciously agreed to join me. Last minute request, really. We just recorded a few short episodes, special edition, talking about the most recent basically presentation that he has done at ETS and has been talking about, which is the problem not only with the history of Islam and the origin of Islam, but also the problem with the primary Islamic sources. And here's what I mean by that, that when you're looking at primary sources, not only like the Quran, but you look at the Hadith, you look at the biography or the Sira of Muhammad, you look at history in general, Tariq, you look at tafsir or commentaries, you begin to realize that we're relying on Islamic sources that we're told basically existed at a certain time, yet you will soon discover that tangible evidence that support their existence, manuscript if you wish, actually prove that those manuscripts existed hundreds of years later, which put basically these primary sources in question. Let me invite Dr. J to join me here and we will begin our discussion over this. Dr. J, as always, thank you so much for your flexibility and your willingness to be with us.
Well, thank you for having me on again. This is fun. We've just done a few short videos, as you mentioned already, concerning this new material. But let me just say that there have been many people that have been asking me to write down everything we've been putting together, because it's one thing to watch a video and to look at PowerPoints. But people who are watching the video, they can't remember where I've said what or when I've said what, and they want something in their hands, and they're saying, Jay, you need to write a book. You need to put this in a book form. So we're doing that. We're in the process of doing that, and I'm now working with Dr. Daniel Janasic, you know Dr. Janasic, he is our MAPI co-director with me on the MAPI program, Master of Arts for Apologetics and Polemics to Islam. He and I are in the process of writing it down. I'm writing in most of it. And what I'm doing is I'm going looking at the book, The Man and the Place, the book being the Quran, the man being Muhammad, and the place being Mecca, and I'm putting them into tabulating them all, everything we have found as of 2025. And we're saying that specifically 2025, because 2026 or 2027, new material will certainly come to light. And we have to keep broadening it and changing the parameters of what we're finding. But as of 2025, we're going to have this book written. We're going to have it out there so all of you can read it. We're going to talk about sources. We're going to talk about and start with Mecca, of course, because Mecca is kind of the foundation of everything that comes after. If Mecca doesn't exist and it wasn't around in 7th century, then it doesn't matter what Muhammad you find. If he's not from Mecca, it's not the Muhammad of Islam. And it doesn't matter what Quran you come across or what Quranic writing you come to. If it's not from Mecca, and was not written with two places called Mecca and Medina, if these places were not even, well, one didn't even exist. Yathrib did exist, but there was not enough people there to create these amazing theological debates that are happening. If there are no Christians and Jews to have these debates with that far south, then it doesn't matter what Quran you find. It's not from Mecca or Medina. It's not the Quran of Islam that was there in the 7th century. So these are the things we're going to be writing down. We've got to get them in one place so that people can read them. Now, what that means is that we're going to start whole new genres, and we're getting it published. And we'll probably be using Dan Brubaker's publishing house to do so. Dan Brubaker is part of MAPI program as well, along with you, Al-Fadi. You're one of our professors, so is Dan Brubaker. And we're now creating a whole stream of new material that's going to be coming out. We're going to have whole genres of material written just on Mecca, other books written just on Muhammad, and other books written on the Quran, creating 3 different genres of writing that will be coming out as a powerhouse, you might say, for the future, so that anybody can come back and know where to do their research, because there's an awful lot of research to be doing. Now, on top of that, we have quite a few students. Al-Fadi, you have students. You've just taught a course for us, and you had over 30 to 40 students in your class. In the class we're just teaching now, we have 30 as well. And these students are writing papers, and these papers are into this whole area of the origins of Islam, which is really what we're talking about today. The origins of Islam. Where did this religion come from? What do we now know? They're writing papers as well. Those are going to be put into books. And they're going to be books that all of you can use and will be able to from here on out. We'll be the first to create this whole new area of research, and we're just going to call it the origins research, which includes both the book, The Man and the Place, but also what we're just going to talk about today, and that is the sources for the book, The Man and the Place. Well, anyways, that's just to introduce us, to whet your appetite so that you can anticipate this. We'll let you know, certainly on CIRA International and also on pfanderfilms, when the book comes out. And then, of course, we'll hope that as many as you can buy the book, then come back to us, see what we're saying, and try to confront us. For heaven's sakes, we need to have this debate on where we're going. Now, the big question that follows that, once we look at the problems with Mecca, once we look at the problems with Muhammad, and once we look at the problems with the Quran, the fourth and the major, or you might say, well, the sources are the first, the major thing we're going to have to do is the next step. What then did happen? How then did Islam really begin? That's the mother lode. And that's the area I'm not willing to say yet. I'm not willing to go that deep. I'm not going to make that dive. Dr. Janasic is ready to do that. He thinks he knows. He thinks that he is willing to make that big dive and actually go out on the lip and actually say what he thinks and how he thinks Islam began. I'm going to let him deal with that material. I'm more interested in the book, The Man and the Place, looking and seeing the problems with this book called the Quran, the man Muhammad, and the place known as Mecca. What he's going to take and what he's going to do is probably what many of you are really waiting for. And that is, from everything we know of this book and the man and the place, from everything we know about the origins of Islam, how then did it happen? Well, you're just going to have to wait till we publish the book to know what the answer to that. Back to you, Al-Fadi.
Well, that's interesting, of course, and you made me aware of this effort about the book, and definitely it's exciting. And a lot of people right here are writing comments about that, and they're eagerly probably anticipating when the book will be published. Now, Dr. J, why don't you tell people a little bit more about why do we have a problem with the primary Islamic sources? We're not talking just the Quran only or the Hadith, but even the rest of these sources.
Yeah, well, this is it. I mean, that is the $1 million question. If this man did exist, this man named Muhammad, in this place called Mecca, receiving this book called the Quran, those are three historical claims right there, right? The historical claims that Muslims have always made and we have made, I mean, on this show. This man, Muhammad, living from 570 to 632, between 610 and 632, receiving a book called the Quran, first from 610 to 622 in a place called Mecca, and then from 622 to 632 in a place called Medina. I've just now made three major historical claims, and it's not me that's making it, it's Muslims that make these three historical claims. Well, then they're going to have to say, or they're going to have to answer, prove it. 2 words, prove it. Prove it that this man, Muhammad, lived in a place called Mecca and then Medina and received a book called the Quran in the 7th century between 610 and 632. Simple question to ask. And we've always been assumed that we know the answer to that. And we've always assumed, everybody that's listened to me, everybody that's listened to you, everybody that's listened to any Muslim or any other scholar has always assumed that we don't know how to answer that question because nothing exists in that time period at that place about this man or that book or even that city. Nothing. We don't have any reference to it. So what has happened is the reason we don't have a reference to it is because nothing was written while he was living, or even immediately after he was living, or even within the same century he was living. Nothing at all. We don't have any document about this man named Muhammad. Notice I'm saying Muhammad. Oh, we have lots of documentation about someone named Muhammad, and Muhammad is well known in Jewish sources and in Christian sources and Zoroastrian sources. We're even getting it from Ethiopic sources. So there is certainly a lot about a Muhammad. Mimha Mimdal, those 4 letters, but not Muhammad. And that's the problem. So what we're doing and what we have been doing in the last year, actually for the last 2 years, we've been saying, well, where then do we get this material about who this man is and how Islam began and everything we know about the origins, this whole question that we're bringing up today? And the answer has always been from everybody that we've talked to, including you heard us say it, is it comes from 200 to 300 years later, from people called Ibn Hisham, or some people would like to start with Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq would be the character who supposedly received this revelation at the beginning of the Abbasid period between 749 and 765 when he died. About that last 15 years that he lived. He then wrote down the biography of Muhammad. But we have nothing by Ibn Ishaq, not one word. We don't have not one sentence or any documents, no manuscript at all. So we've thrown it out. And we've always gone to a man who comes 70 years later, a guy named Ibn Hisham. Now, Ibn Hisham takes what he assumed was from Ibn Ishaq, written by his students, and he throws out most of it and only retains what he likes and writes the Sira, the story of Muhammad. That's what you've been told. That's what I've been told. That's what we've all assumed. Why would we assume any different? Because we assumed that the Muslims knew what they were talking about. Well, then we find out a few years ago, the Germans came knocking on my door, and Dr. Robert Kerr, a good friend of mine, and he now is the one that kind of was laughing when I brought this up. He says, Jay, we don't have anything from Ibn Hisham. I said, we don't? He said, okay, stop and think. If a man named Ibn Hisham had written this in the last 20 years of his life, so around 800 to 833, the last 33 years of his life, that's in the 9th century. That's pretty recent. We're only talking about 1,200 years ago, and there's many documents written in the 9th century that existed today. And if he's commissioned by the caliph is the ruler of that time, he would have been writing on parchment and on vellum, which would last well into today because that's animal skin. They were not dependent on papyrus like we are with our earliest documents from the 1st and 2nd century. They had parchment to work with. So it would be the question you should be asking, Jay, he said to me, is where is that manuscript by Ibn Hisham? Just show me one manuscript. That should be easy to find. And of course, I'm sitting here saying, of course it is. It's got to be somewhere in some library, in some museum. I had never thought through asking this question. And Dr. Robert Kirsch started laughing at me. He says, no, you're not going to like the answer I'm going to give you. I said, well, what are you talking about? He says, we in Germany have been smiling all this time because the Germans are the ones who actually produced the Sira of Muhammad. I said, the Germans? He said, yeah, one man specifically. His name is Wustenfeld. Heinrich Ferdinand Wustenfeld, who is a German Arabist living in Germany. And he went to 6 different documents, 6 different manuscripts that he put together to find this, to create or to introduce or to put together what he knows as the Sira, the biography of Muhammad. I said, 6? What do you mean documents? What are you talking about? I thought they were all written by Ibn Shah. I thought we had it. He says, no. He was living in Germany, and in a 2-year period from 1858 to 1860, that 2-year period, he went to a manuscript which is in Morocco called the Fez manuscript, and it was written in 1053. I said 1063. I said 1063. That's the earliest document we went to. That's the 11th century. So it's not the 9th century. It's 11th century. That's 200 years later. He says he only used about 25% of it. He threw the rest away. 75% he didn't even use. He didn't consider it to be important. And so he only grabbed what he liked. Here's a German scholar deciding what Muhammad did, depending on what he himself felt was important or not. And I said, well, weren't there any Muslims around to correct him? I said, what Muslims would around? No Muslim has ever done this before. No Muslim decided to do this. It was a German who decided to do this. And then he went to some other documents. I said, well, where are they from? Well, you have one that comes from the British Library from 1278. That's the 13th century. And another one that comes from the Bodleian Library, which is in Oxford. And that's from 1324. That's the 14th century. Another one from the 14th century over in Chester Beatty manuscript, which are in Dublin. And then another one that comes from the 15th century from 1420 in the BNF. That's the Bibliothèque Nationale Library, Nationale de Paris. That's the one in Paris. And then finally, another manuscript that which he took most of his material from was back in the SOAS library known as the 19320 manuscript, which is from 1589. That's the 16th century. This was written in the 6th century, and he took these manuscripts, these 6 manuscripts, from the 11th, 13th, 14th, 14th, 15th, and 16th century and put it together into the biography we have today. And they published it in 1860 there in Germany, in German, which... then we have our good friend Guillaume that took it out of German, put it into French, and that was into English, and that's what you read today. So here I found out that this German scholar is the one that gives us the Muhammad that everybody's following. This Muhammad that everybody's following is not from Ibn Hisham at all. This Muhammad that everybody follows in his life and what he did all comes from a German scholar written in the 1800s, that's the 19th century, redacting it back to a man named Ibn Hisham from the 9th century, but getting his documents from the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 16th century. And I said, yikes, the world wants to know this. You're probably the first time any of you have heard this today, but that's just the Sira. That's just the Sira. If you want to go to other documents, let's say the Hadith. The Hadith are even more exciting because the Hadith are the ones that Muslims use to know how to walk, talk, eat, drink, and sleep. And they've always been told, and you've been told, and I've been told, that these come from Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Tirmidhi, Ibn Dawud, Mata, and also Nisai. These are the 6 compilations that we know what Muhammad said. And these are the ones that are all written in 870, 875, right up until 915. So late 9th century, early 10th century, which is bad enough when you stop and think about it, because none of these guys were there when Muhammad was living. And I always thought that was bad enough, because these are all late 9th century, early 10th century for a guy who was speaking in the early 7th century. That's 270 and to 300 years later. And he started laughing. He says, no, none of these guys didn't write anything. He showed me one manuscript. Show me one manuscript by Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Sahih Bukhari, or any of these 6 compilations from the 9th century. Show me one. Show me one extant manuscript. And this is what we're talking about. Extant manuscript means manuscripts that we can see in our hand today that came from these guys from the 9th and 10th century. See, everybody's demanded us of Christianity to do that with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we couldn't come up with anything for the first century. And the reason we couldn't come up with anything with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or Paul's letters, or Peter's epistles, the reason we can't find any of them because they were written on papyrus, which disintegrates within about 100 years. So we have to go to copies of copies of copies, but yet we still find papyri that exist from the 2nd century, the Bottom papyrus, and John Ryland's manuscript. We then have Chester Beatty manuscripts, which start to appear in the 3rd and 4th century, and then we have the entire New Testament, two codices right from the 4th century, the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, and then the Alexandrinus from the 5th century. That's 200 to 300 years before Muhammad, before Islam. We have 3 metropolitan codices of the entire New Testament. So all we're asking of Muslims is to find one manuscript of this man named Muhammad, what he said, what he did, from the century he lived, from the 7th century. See, if we can find material that goes back to the 4th and 5th century, entire manuscripts for what Jesus said and did, because that's the same genre, what he said and is the Hadith of Jesus. What he did is that the Sira of Jesus, that's the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's the same genre, the same equivalence. If we can do that from the 4th and 5th century, certainly they can do that from the 7th century, because this is all written by men who were under the authority of the caliphs. Caliphs don't depend on papyrus. They're rich, they're wealthy. They would have written it in codex form. They would have written on vellum and certainly on parchment. That's why all the earliest manuscripts for the Quran are written on parchment. And they're written on vellum, on animal skins. They're preserved, and they would be preserved until today. So I said, okay, well, so when are these extant manuscripts existing? And these Germans are laughing at us because the Germans are so far ahead of us. You know, God bless the Germans, but they've been keeping it in German. They didn't want the world to know this. And they say, take a look. The first manuscript, the first extant manuscript we have of any of the Hadith is the one by Abu Dawud. Abu Dawud is the first we get, and that is from the 11th century. 11th century. He is supposedly writing in the 9th century. His first manuscript doesn't appear till the 11th century. That's 200 years after. That is 400 years after Muhammad. The next one is Ibn an-Nasai, and he appears in the 12th century, though he's supposed to have written this in the 9th century. That's 300 years later. And then we have Ibn Majah, who writes in the 13th century. That's 400 years later. And then Tirmidhi also writes in the 14th century. That's 500 years later, along with Sahih Muslim. Notice, Sahih Muslim does not appear until the 14th century. The first extant manuscript we have for Sahih Muslim is not to the 14th century. That's 500 years later. And then we get Al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari, the mother lode. What every Muslim needs to walk, talk, eat, drink, sleep, they have to go to Al-Bukhari, Sahih Bukhari, because he is perfect. And we assume that he wrote his material in the 9th century. His documents don't appear in the form that we use today until the 14th and 15th century. Folks, can you see why I had to shake my head when I heard this? That's 800 years too late. 800 years too late that we finally get Al-Bukhari, the man that Muslims have to go to. Now, this is new for many of you, and we've been researching this for the last 2 years. But we wanted to start putting this up, and I'm going to be putting up on my pfanderfilms. So we're going to start putting this up on Sira and letting the Muslims hear this. We now know also where the tafsir and the tahriq come from. The tafsir and the tahriq were written by a Dutchman, not by a German, but by a Dutchman named Michael Jan de Reuge, who was writing between 1879 and 1901. I kid you not. 1879 to 1901. He is the one that gives us Al-Tabari. He is the one that gives us the Tafsir and the Tariq. And he's writing in the last century. But where did he get his documents from? From the 13th century. Yeah, go ahead. Back to you, Al-Fadi.
I just wanted to let you know that we're approaching the end of time. I think you needed to leave. So wanted to just ask you, where can people go and watch your most recent presentation in addition to what we have done? You did a public one. Is it available on pfanderfilms?
It's actually, I did it in San Diego just last month. And it was there, and Dr. William Craig came to listen. Mike Licona came to listen. Sam Shamoun came to listen. We had about 100 people that just walked in the door. They're not supposed to. They're not part of the Islamic track as I presented this new material. And it was the first time they'd ever heard it. Even Sam Shamoun said, boy, I need this material. He said, this just blows everything out. Because what it does, it pretty much shuts down any notion that we know anything about this man, Muhammad, or how Islam began. We know nothing about what he said and did from the 9th and 10th century. It's from the 11th to the 16th century, written by European scholars mostly, not all, by European scholars in the 19th and the 20th century. So if that is the case, then what this does and what we're going to be doing and what we now have to show, because I've not put this up on pfanderfilm yet. Everybody's saying we need to write this down. So I'm going to be writing it down. You're going to be getting in this book that I talked about at the very beginning of this show so that everybody can have it in their hands. But we need to make sure that we show you where those manuscripts are. Those manuscripts, what's interesting, almost all these manuscripts are in Europe. And these, look at the dates that I've been giving you, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century. The majority of them are Ottoman manuscripts. Ottoman manuscript redacted back to the 9th and 10th century, affirming and assuming them that they're attributed to these men who they supposedly are attributing it to someone who knew Muhammad or heard what he said and what he did. So those are oral tradition, the 9th and 10th century, but these are not even oral traditions. These are manuscripts that probably have been gone. There may be someone named Ibn Hisham. Now, I'm not disputing that there's no one named Al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim. I'm not disputing these men existed in the 9th and 10th century. We just have nothing that they wrote. And what has happened, we have 200 to 400 years of recension after recension after recension, destroying that which has gone ahead, so that finally they are written in their final form, and that's what we're using today around the 14th and 15th and 16th century, and even later in the 19th and 20th century by the Europeans. All of these are nothing more than attributions, and these are what we call redactions. Now, Christians, we know what we're talking about because we do the same thing in Christianity. Be careful. We have the Gospel of Thomas, we have the Gospel of Judas, we have many other gospels, the Gospel of Barnabas. These are gospels that are all over the world. When people look at them, but no one uses them. Why? Because we know when they were written. We know the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas were written in the 2nd and 3rd century, redacted back to someone named Thomas, but they were not written by Thomas, and no one suggests that the Gospel of Judas is written by Judas. And certainly the Gospel of Barnabas is written in 1634. That's the 17th century, attributed to the companion of Paul, but we throw them out because they are too late. So as Christians, we would throw all of these material out because they are so late. That's why Muslims have done just the opposite. They've taken the latest material from the 11th, 12th, 13th, 15th, 16th century, even that which is then finally compiled and canonized in the 18th and 19th and 20th century, and said that this is their official documents. We as Christians would never do that. And thank God we don't have this problem. Now, I'd like to see how Muslims are going to support this. How are they going to defend this? Because really what we're showing and what we're saying, we know the Muslims know nothing about their man, what he did, what they said. All they know is what the Ottomans finally finalized and canonized, what they said their man. And notice, what they said usually was what they wanted him to say, because they have a theological dispute, they have a practical problem. They want to make sure that their theological dispute, their doctrine, their theology is applicated. The best way to do that is to put the name of Muhammad, one of his companions, one of those from who was either the Sahaba or the Tabi'un, or those who are the Hadith writers or the Sira writers, so that they could get authority for what they want to attribute to that too. But that is all from the Ottoman period. So what I'm suggesting, I'm only suggesting this, is that these are nothing. What we're getting, everything we know about Muhammad, what he said and what he did and how Islam began, is what the Ottomans thought he said and did. Because the extant manuscripts from their time period, and not from the Abbasid period, and certainly not from the Umayyad period.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. J, and thank you, everyone. By the way, we are wrapping up our live stream, and just wanted to report to you that today we recorded a number of interesting video series, one with Dr. J about these issues that he's raising right now with the problems related to the dating of primary Islamic sources. We did also a video series with Mel, Islamic Origins, which he's joining us right here, by the way, in the chat. So a shout out to Mel. Thank you so much for taking the time to do so. We recorded also a video series with him about really the possible origin of Islam from a Jewish and a Christian backgrounds, and I'll let you watch that series to know what I mean by that. And also, for the first time, we did a video series with Saint Murad, and we basically highlighted his own English translations of the Quran, and we showed how many of the translators of the Quran into English are dishonest and deceptive in the way they try to present to you their own Islamic view and doctrinal views when they're doing the translation, rather than to stick with the Arabic words and the lexicon and try to be fair, linguistically speaking. So, folks, again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your prayers, and pray that I will be able to come back to doing my normal live streams as before. Until then, everyone, have a blessed day. Take care.
Fadi speaks out with a voice so clear, bringing a message for all to hear. From the Quran to the Bible's grace, he points to Jesus who stands in place, revealing the light, one truth to show. Jesus is God, this he knows. From deserts wide to cities tight, Al-Fadi shares this holy sight. In mosques and churches, the question